real trick to doing any sort of cabinetry project like this, and this is a cabinet, clamp cabinet, if you would. The real trick is handling the sheet materials. If you go to Europe, plywood comes at you in I mean, one more thing on the clamp cabinet. Drew asked me to mention this to you. If we had to do it again, we'd spend more money on casters. We went and got some very cheap casters, and now we are paying the price. So there's already one of them that's frozen up here. The plywood. Plywood in America comes in humongous 4x8 sheets, and we sort of pay for that in the fact that we get a lot of plywood for our money, but we then have to manhandle it and around, and that can be a little bit more difficult than you think if you've been reading our old advertising in the 50s and the 60s. We used to put out those pictures with a guy standing there in a 4x8 sheet of plywood, and he's pushing it across the Mark V, cutting to the middle of a 4x8 sheet. And yes, you can do that. With the misleading part of that is that can you do it without four friends who can read your mind and know that when you have to push the sheet this way or that way in order to follow the fence. It's not something that you really want to do on the Shopsmith. Not for the least of which reasons. It's not just the weight of the stuff, but the fact that when you've got a 4x8 sheet on this, it's hard to reach the on and off switch. I would suggest, and I tell all my students here at the Academy, first bust up the sheet. And I'm going to show you an easy way to do that. Get it down to manageable sizes that then you can cut on your Shopsmith or whatever you're using to cut plywood. If you go down to on the blackboard, you will see something called plywood sawing jigs. These are some jigs that I published a long time ago in a book called Woodworking Wisdom. They're extremely simple. You can make them from 2x4s and some scraps of plywood, but they are wonderfully useful. The first problem in cutting up plywood is to have proper support. If you put plywood between two sawhorses, it sags. When you make a cut off, part of it drops off or it pinches the blade. In this case, as you can see, let's look over here. I'll just scoot this board over here. I have a special sawhorse where the rail of the sawhorse is actually a 2x8. Into that 2x8, I have cut some 3.5-inch deep slots that hold 2x4s. So I have a piece here, a support grid that will support the sheet not only in the side-to-side direction, but also in the end-to-end direction. So if I bring the sheet back here and cut it in two, the parts won't drop off, my saw won't be pitched. There is complete support. There is even support if you get a small piece. If I were to want to cut up just a small piece of plywood for some reason on this, I can cut it right here, cut it in two, and still both sides would be supported. It provides proper support for all sheets, both large and small. The cutting grid that I show you in the downloadable project plans is actually made so that you can make that grid and mount it on the sawhorses you may already have. If you want to make a special set of sawhorses like we have here, that's cool too. But the main thing is you have to have rails that run in both directions to provide support in 2 dimensions. Of course, once you've got the support, is the next problem is how do you make accurate cuts? We're going to use a skill saw here, but as anyone who has tried to follow a line with a skill saw knows, that can be a little bit dicey, especially dicey if the blade is just a bit dull. What I've got here are 2 pieces of plywood that I have glued together. If you look at the end here, you'll see that the top piece is a 3-inch strip of 3/4 inch thick plywood. The bottom is a 10-inch wide strip of 1/4 inch plywood. They're just set one on top of the other with a little step on the back. That's a 3/4 inch step there on the back, if you can take a look. That's a clamping ledge. You'll see how that's used a little later on here. The edge that is facing right now on this 3/4 inch strip is the factory edge of a 4x8 sheet of plywood. We actually, Drew and I, cut this last night from the piece of plywood that you're seeing right here. The factory edge on a good piece of plywood. Now, if you want to know what I mean by good plywood, you can go into the Choosing Plywood editorial that I wrote, and I'll define it very, very well for you. But you need a piece of good quality plywood, and as those come out, they are ripped by gang saws. And the cuts that they make along the edges are perfectly straight and perfectly parallel. So when you buy a piece of good quality 4x8 plywood, you have 2 good straight guides, one on either one of the factory edges. So we cut this 3-inch strip off of one of the edges and glued it to this backing board here. When I glued it up, now there is a chance that this thing could develop a slight bow, especially if there's some tension in the plywood. So when I glued it up, I stretched a string from this corner here to that corner there, okay, pulled it taut, and made sure that the string was not touching, nor is it too far away. This had to be perfectly straight and parallel as I clamped it up. And as I sight down it right now, it is very, very accurate. So the next thing that we need to do, it's not quite finished yet, is we need to trim the 1/4 inch plywood. This is a Makita skill saw, and mounted on this Makita skill saw is an extremely good blade. This is one of the better ones that we could find in the 7 1/4. I'm going to step off camera here for a minute. I'll get some electricity that I can attach to this. The Makita is a medium quality saw. It's not the best, but I always tell my students around here that if you have $150 to spend on a sawing system, a $50 saw with a $100 blade is going to cut a whole lot better than a $100 saw with a $50 blade. Put your money into the tool that actually does the cutting. This saw will do a fantastic job with this blade mounted on it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to clamp this down. I'm going to trim off the 1/4 inch piece of plywood. Once I do that, the trimmed edge will act as an indicator From then on, all I'll have to do to position this guide on my plywood is simply line up that edge with the marks that I'll make on the plywood. The drawback is that I will always, forever, from this moment forward, when I'm using this particular jig, I will have to use it with this particular saw and this particular saw blade. This is not a jig that is, in a manner of speaking, transferable. Let me clamp this down. I'm going to overhang it a little bit from the plywood, about an inch or so. You can see as I'm clamping here, you can see the reasons for that clamping ledge. On the plans that I put in Woodworking Wisdom, this bar is moved back to the back edge of the 1/4 inch plywood. That means that this clamp sits about 3/4 of an inch higher. And I found that there are some skill saws out there that where the motor may bump into the clamp when it's set at that level. So with this setup, the clamp is actually slightly below the surface of the guiding bar. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do, let's see. Hi guys. Okay. Sorry, we're asleep at the switch here, folks. I'm going to adjust the Makita so that it cuts no more than 1/4 of an inch deep. Put on some safety glasses and make the cut. That's a nice cut blade. I haven't used that blade yet. All right. The jig is now ready to use. I'm going to cut a 24-inch wide piece from this sheet of plywood, using this as a guide. To do that, I'm going to measure 24 inches from this end. Make a mark. And 24 inches from that end. And make another mark. And that's all the measuring I have to do. Now I'm going to take this guide. Now, in every saw cut, there is a waste side and a save side, okay? In this particular saw cut, this is the save side over here. This is the 24-inch piece we're going to want to keep. This is the waste side. Put your guide so that it sits over the save side. Line up the edge so that it splits those marks you just made, and clamp it down. That's all there is to it. Ready to go. Well, not quite. once again, we have to adjust the saw for the proper depth of cut. Then in this case, we want it to cut just a little deeper than 1 inch. We want it to cut, it's sitting on top of the jig, which is 1/4 of an inch thick, and then it's got to go through 3/4 of an inch of plywood. So let me put this in place, and that looks to be about it right there. Okay, mind your cord, and go. Remove the clamps. And now let's see how we've done. There we go. Right on the line. 24 inches there. And 24 inches there. Really accurate cut. Now, there are some folks that would rather not trust the accuracy of a skill saw. I can understand that. It's not one of the things that I ordinarily would have thought of, but believe me, it does work. I've done 2 kitchens using nothing more than this guide and this support to cut the wood for the cabinets, and it works well. But there are times when I like to bust up a sheet of plywood and then trim it to the sizes that I want on the Mark V. You may prefer to do it all that way. If that is the case, when you cut a piece of wood free from the board, when you bust this up, make sure that each of the pieces that you take to the Mark V have a factory edge on them. Remember, the factory edge is the straight edge. Start with that, using that to guide your first cut. Set it up against your fence or your miter gauge, your crosscut sliding table. Make your first cut. Then you will either have 2 parallel sides or a square corner. Work from there out. And you'll get really good results that way. One more thing that will come in handy when you're doing plywood. I'm going to shove this out of the way a little bit, okay, and bring the Mark V in. We have an auxiliary table system, which is good not only for cutting up large pieces of wood, but also for making joinery in large pieces, as I'll show you in a moment. This auxiliary table system can be configured in many different ways. In fact, as you probably are almost tired of hearing by now, both Drew and I look at the Shopsmith as if it were this giant configurable jig that you can set up in a million different ways to do a million different things. And it is. You'll have all these pieces and parts that you can plug together, and the only limit is your imagination. I'm going to show you what my imagination tells me is a pretty nice way to set it up for sawing and for cutting dados and rabbits. Let me take off this dado blade because I'm going to need it for the next segment. taken, you actually have in this system, you have your main table, and then you have two types of auxiliary tables. I'm going to talk about these tables as being floating tables, and this table as being the auxiliary table. This is the one with the posts, and you can mount this either in the base or the headstock. I've got it mounted in the base right now. Now I'm going to put one of the floating tables, or I have put one of the floating tables, on these 5-foot bars. I'm going to take that, put that in place, and push it in. Now on the this all is I'll put the floating tables in place on the bars. Now, let's, at this point, you would want to adjust this table system for your depth of cut. Then bring up your auxiliary table to where it lines up with the 5-foot bars. Started and push it in. Now, at this point, you can lock this all down. At least lock the 5-foot bars in place. You may want to let the tables float for a while until you actually need to lock them down. The important part about this setup is that I've left a space over here so that I can reach the switch. You do not want to cover the Mark V switch with either the floating tables or the auxiliary tables. Do not do that. It's believe me, you could find yourself groping for the switch underneath here in an emergency moment. You don't want to grope. You want to be able to see it at all times. But this, I got one of these on backwards. Okay. You knew I was going to mess up sooner or later. As I said, this is a great system for large pieces and parts. We're not going to saw anything on here today. You know how to saw, but in a moment we're going to take this and do some dados and rabbets.